Rome feared monsters until the monster became Rome. They called him Little Boot, a child marching between legions, laughing under banners wet with foreign rain. Soldiers lifted him onto their shoulders as if he were a lucky charm, a living promise that the empire had a future gentler than its past. No one imagined that the boy would one day teach the empire new meanings of fear. Before the name Caligula meant terror, it meant affection. Before it meant executioner, it meant son. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus into a family that treated power the way other families treated religion, something to be worshipped and something to be killed for. His father was Rome's golden general, his mother the proud descendant of Augustus, and around them circled relatives who smiled with poison already hiding behind their teeth. Caligula learned early that in the imperial house love sounded very much like a threat. When he was 7, his father died. The city said illness, the palace whispered convenience. Soon after, his mother was arrested, starved slowly on an island while Rome pretended not to notice. His brothers followed her into disappearance. Childhood ended not with a memory, but with a lesson. The people closest to you are the easiest to bury. The boy was taken to Capri to live with the Emperor Tiberius, an old man carved from suspicion. Capri was beautiful from a distance, white cliffs, blue water, sunlight that looked innocent. But inside the villas, the air tasted of surveillance. Every corridor had ears, every kindness had a price. Ancient writers filled those rooms with stories of humiliations and secret games, of a court where cruelty wore silk and called itself discipline. We cannot know how much was true. We only know the result. A child learned to survive by watching how power enjoyed hurting the weak. Caligula studied carefully. He discovered that laughter could be sharper than knives, that obedience was never enough, that an emperor did not need to be loved if he was feared with imagination. By the time Tiberius grew old and frightened of his own shadow, the boy had already become a mirror for the worst habits of the palace. When Tiberius finally died, Rome celebrated like a city released from winter. He was 24, radiant with youth, the last bright branch of a family people still wanted to believe in. Crowds poured into the streets shouting his name. Prison doors opened, exiles were recalled, debts forgiven. He staged games so generous that bakers ran out of bread and the Tiber smelled of wine. For a few fragile months, the empire convinced itself that goodness had inherited the throne. Coins showed his gentle profile, poets compared him to the dawn, senators spoke of a second Augustus, a ruler who would heal the scars left by the old tyrant. Caligula walked among them smiling, playing the role perfectly, as if he too wanted to believe the costume. Then his body betrayed him. A sudden illness struck, fevers that burned for weeks, nights of delirium, seizures that left him staring at walls only he could read. When he returned to public life, the face was familiar, but the man behind it had shifted, like a statue cracked from within. Something had woken up. Power no longer felt like responsibility. It felt like permission. He began with small experiments. A senator was ordered to run beside the imperial chariot until his lungs bled. Another was invited to a banquet only to watch his wife led away for the emperor's amusement. Caligula described her performance the next morning with the cheerful detail of a theater critic. Laughter followed him everywhere, thin and dangerous. Rome had endured cruel rulers before, but they had at least pretended to wear masks of dignity. Caligula wanted the opposite.
He wanted to see how far a proud city could bend before it snapped, how deeply humiliation could be planted in noble soil. He discovered that people fear pain, but they fear ridicule even more. The Senate learned to applaud its own disgrace. Aristocrats competed to invent new gestures of obedience, terrified of being the one face that did not smile quickly enough. The emperor watched them the way a bored child watches insects, wondering which leg to remove next. Sex became another instrument. He treated bodies as arguments, affairs as public speeches. Wives of powerful men were summoned like decorations, displayed and returned with stories that followed them forever. He spoke casually of sleeping with sisters, of marrying the moon, of being desired by goddesses. Whether these tales were true mattered less than their effect. Boundaries dissolved in the heat of his imagination. Caligula understood that a ruler becomes absolute not when laws fall, but when shame does. He began to dress as Jupiter, as Venus, as Hercules, walking between columns while priests offered sacrifices to his reflection. Statues across the empire received his face, and the people were asked to kneel before marble copies of a living man. The Republic, already a ghost, was finally buried beneath incense. There was no Rome anymore. There was only Caligula, and the silence he called peace.
Caligula discovered something dangerous. Fear is addictive, but silence is even more intoxicating. The quieter Rome became, the louder he grew inside his own head. He began to speak of enemies no one could see. He heard insults in applause, conspiracies in compliments. Power no longer satisfied him. It had to entertain him. He walked through the palace at night, unable to sleep, talking to statues of the gods as if they were rivals. Servants said he argued with Jupiter, threatened Neptune, promised to whip the sea for disobedience. Whether these stories were true or embroidered by terrified witnesses no longer mattered. The empire believed them, and belief was enough. Money vanished like blood into sand. Games grew more extravagant, punishments more theatrical. Caligula ordered a bridge of ships across the Bay of Naples so he could ride in triumph dressed as Alexander the Great, proving he was greater than nature itself. Senators applauded with trembling hands, wondering which of them would be next to disappear. He began to look at Rome not as a city, but as a body given to him for dissection. Executions were no longer hidden, they became lessons. He made fathers watch their sons die, then invited them to dinner the same evening and demanded smiles. He forced victims to thank him for their deaths, insisting that suffering should be grateful for his attention. Cruelty turned creative. One man was cut open slowly so Caligula could study how pain moved through a face. Another was spared only so he could live with the memory of begging on his knees. The emperor learned to measure loyalty not by obedience, but by how much degradation a person could survive. And still the crowds cheered because the alternative was terror. The palace filled with mirrors. Caligula spent hours studying his reflection, practicing expressions of mercy and rage as if they were costumes. He no longer knew which face was real. Perhaps none of them were. Those closest to him understood the truth first. The emperor was not playing a role anymore. The role was playing him. Among the guards was a tribune named Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula loved to humiliate. The emperor mocked his voice, questioned his manhood, forced him to endure jokes that tasted like slow poison. Tyrants often forget a simple rule. The person you enjoy breaking most is the one who will finally break you.
While Caligula planned new spectacles, an expedition against Britain that looked more like theater than war, a different plan grew in whispers beneath the palace floors. Senators, officers, even members of his own household began to imagine the impossible, a Rome without its god. On the last day, the emperor attended games in his honor. The crowd roared as always. The sun was bright. Children waved branches. For a moment, the nightmare looked like a festival. Caligula left the arena through a narrow corridor lined with guards. He joked, complained about the noise, spoke of dinner. He did not see the faces around him harden into a single decision. Cassius stepped forward and called him by an insult the emperor had once used for him. Caligula turned, confused, and the first blade entered his throat. The rest was not assassination. It was release. More than 30 wounds opened across his body. Guards who had sworn to die for him now competed to strike. The man who had called himself a god bled like any animal on the stones. Outside, Rome did not know whether to celebrate or hide. His wife and little daughter were murdered within hours, as if the empire wanted to erase the future he might have produced. The palace was suddenly silent, filled only with echoes of a voice that had demanded worship the day before. When the Senate gathered, they spoke of restoring the Republic, of learning from the horror. But empires do not wake from nightmares so easily. Another emperor was already waiting behind the curtain, and the machine of power continued to breathe. Caligula ruled less than 4 years. It was enough. Enough to teach Rome that civilization is thinner than marble. Enough to show that a child raised among predators might one day become the most dangerous predator of all. Enough to prove that tyranny is not born from strength, but from wounds that power teaches to sing. People like to ask whether Caligula was mad or simply evil. The question is comforting because it suggests a safe distance. But the truth is worse. He was human, and Rome helped him become what he was. Every crowd that applauded, every senator who knelt, every friend who stayed silent added another brick to the prison that eventually swallowed them all. Power became fear, fear became madness, madness became blood. And when the blood dried, the empire discovered the oldest lesson of history. Tyrants do not fall from the sky. They are built, slowly, carefully, by the very world that later calls them monsters. If you want to understand how easily it can happen again, stay with this channel. Subscribe to the Price of Dynasties, where crowns are heavy, palaces have teeth, and history remembers not the cheers, but the screams. Rome feared monsters, until a monster learned to wear Rome like a crown.